Hi, and welcome to another episode of The Savvy Entrepreneur. Today, we won't be talking about business, but we'll be talking about the community here in Longmont. We're here with Kathleen McGoey, who is the head of the Community Justice Partnership. So, Kathleen, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Tallis. Thanks so much for having me.
I appreciate you joining. I hadn't heard about your entity, uh, in my 3 years of living here in Longmont. But recently, when I heard about it, I thought I had to have you on my show because it's such a huge, impactful program that you're leading. So let's share with the audience the really impactful work that you do.
Yeah, thanks so much for this opportunity. So, again, my name's Kathleen McGoey. I'm the executive director of Longmont Community Justice Partnership, or LCJP. We are a 501c3 nonprofit that was founded in 1994. And so we're actually celebrating almost 26 years of existence at this point, which is so fantastic. And our organization exists to provide restorative justice services to the Longmont community. And restorative justice, in short, is an alternative to the criminal justice system. It's available to both youth and adults in Longmont. And we provide that service in partnership with the Longmont Police with the help of an incredible team of community volunteers.
And you guys have been doing this for quite a while, right?
Yeah, so the organization was founded in 94, which makes us one of the longest running restorative justice programs in the country, to my knowledge. And initially, the organization only served juvenile first time offenders who had no criminal record. And over the years, because of the success of the program, we currently can serve offenders of any age. They can be as young as 10 years old, as old as we've had an individual in their 80s who came to restorative justice in the last few years. And we can work with people who have a criminal record and who have petty misdemeanor or felony level offenses pending. And that's what's brought them to restorative justice.
That's great. And you guys really do, I can't say this enough, really impact the community in a very positive manner. I didn't even know how impactful your organization was until you shared the documentary with me. You want to chat a bit about the documentary and the incredible stats that you guys have?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So in 2018, well, it's kind of an interesting story for folks who are in the media. LCJP has gotten a call almost once a year from a documentary maker. There's a CNN program with Van Jones that reached out to us. I'm blanking on the name right now, the Redemption Project. They reached out to us, but with all of those requests, for the most part, they're looking to follow a story from the point of referral to the point of completion of the program. And, when you think about it, someone who's committed a crime has taken responsibility. So they're given this option of going through restorative justice. And then the victim or harm party, if they give their consent, that allows the case to move forward. Those individuals, we use the term responsible and harm party instead of offender and victim, trying to get them to allow their personal story to be told, potentially in a film or a TV show before they even really know what's going to happen is a pretty big ask. So we've had to explain that to the media over the years. Now, this group that produced the documentary, it's called How to Love Your Enemy, a restorative justice story. And it's produced by a group called Free the People. They came to us, and what I did was try to pitch back the alternative story because I really think that the story that's meant to be told is how restorative justice is so effective when it's community based and occurs with partnership with police, which is a very exceptional model right now. Most restorative justice throughout this country happens within district attorneys' offices or schools. And so fortunately, Free the People, amazing team, Sam Martin and Matt Battaglia were the primary producers, and they said yes to this alternative story. They came several times over the course of 2019 to film here in Longmont and put together what I think is an incredibly accurate and heartfelt description of how LCJP impacts the community, like you said.
Yeah, I had no idea that Longmont had a policing problem prior to the community justice program.
Yeah, I haven't been here. I started working at LCJP in 2013, so I wasn't around at the very beginning, but there were some incidents of violence in this community in the 80s. We had a much larger gang population in Longmont at that time as well. And so due to the incident of violence and the challenge with gang related crime, the community really rose to the occasion and said, how can we do things differently? Right? Chief Mike Butler, our recently retired public safety chief, has always been a visionary and has been interested in changing the perception and the dynamic and the way that law enforcement interacts with the community. So there were several responses. An amazing community organizing group in Longmont called El Comité formed for advocacy for the Latinx community primarily at that time. They do a wide range of really important things now. Longmont Public Safety put together the Gang and Crime Suppression Unit, which was a really intentional effort to address the gang problem, but sort of not the symptoms, but the root causes. And from my understanding, they partnered with the Longmont Youth Center to really start reaching out to families, children of young ages who might be at risk of going that direction. And in effect, those efforts, along with restorative justice, have really quelled the increase in gang membership, gang participation in Longmont. I mean, it's almost absent altogether. So yeah, we're really proud of being part of that effort. It wasn't restorative justice alone, but I would say that by giving young people an alternative through restorative justice where they don't internalize that label of, oh, now I'm a thief, now I'm a vandal, oh, now I'm expelled, now what am I going to do, now I'm hanging out all the time. Restorative justice can really change the trajectory of those individuals who are maybe right on the edge, making some decisions that could have really long lasting impacts to their lives.
And you guys don't just give second chances, you guys completely change the course of people's behavior. The recidivism rate is dramatic. Do you want to discuss that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, restorative justice, the heart of restorative justice is about giving those who have been harmed a voice in the justice process. So when I say those who have been harmed, we're talking about victims and community members. After that sort of primary goal or intention, the next thing we're looking at is how can we meet the primary need of victims of crime? The majority of victims that I've met with over these last 8 years identify that their primary need is to know that the person who caused them harm isn't going to cause that harm to somebody else. That is what comes up far more often than any desire for revenge or retaliation. And so, we look at that and we say, okay, well, what can we do to walk alongside the victim and the community and empower, give agency to that responsible person to see the consequences of their decisions, to feel validated in who they are as a meaningful member of the community, and to make choices according to their bigger life goals. So one of the ways that we do that is we utilize a strengths-based process. So what that means is while the focus of the restorative justice process is to identify what are the harms and what can the responsible person do to repair the harmed relationships that have been caused by their actions, we also have a very specific part of our process where we say, okay, for this responsible person, who are you outside of this one incident, right? So if I'm the responsible person and I've been referred because of causing some vandalism in my neighborhood or my neighbor's house. The group that gathers, community volunteers, will express a sincere interest in saying, okay, well, Kathleen, what are your strengths and your goals? We can support you in taking responsibility for harm, but we also want to highlight who you are, separating person from behavior and utilizing those strengths and talents to help me make things right. So for example, for me, in high school, let's say this, I was a teenager. I was really artistic in high school. I also played sports. I really looked up to my older brothers. I still do. And so something that might be in discussion is there some way that you could use your artistic talents to make something to represent your learning, or to make a gift for your neighbor, something to express an apology. Or it could be something more sort of conventional, like if I caused damage that was at a financial cost to the neighbor, I might commit to paying them back through restitution. And I'll just wrap up by saying the data that you've asked about a couple times. So our most important measurement of data is that harm parties, victims, and community representatives report at 100% feeling satisfied with the restorative justice process, with about 98% of participating victims saying that they felt that the responsible person was held accountable for their actions. Between 90 and 95% of the responsible parties or offenders who participate in the Restorative Justice Conference will complete their contract to repair harm. So that's one of our other really important measurements of success, which then relates to the big question people are curious about is recidivism, or reoffense rates. And there's a study that's been completed by some economics professors at CU Boulder that shows that from 2006 to 2019, there were approximately 2,500 offenders referred to LCJP. And out of that 2,500, over the 13-year period, only 3.5% of those individuals reoffended within the community of Longmont, or the city of Longmont, I should say, to be specific. So we're very proud of those numbers. We're really impressed by the commitment and the investment of police and community to support this program, and we're looking forward to being able to share that report more broadly.
And you guys have been able to do all of this with a very, let's say, meager budget, right?
Well, I don't know what the entrepreneurs would say, but yes, we have done a lot with a little. I agree.
And you guys not only have your staff, but you have a lot of volunteers as well, correct?
Yeah.
So what are the types of things that our audience could do if they wanted to get involved with your entity? What kind of volunteer opportunities are there?
Yeah, well, I'll share. I was waiting to see where you might go with the financial question, because I know that's of interest to entrepreneurs especially. So I want to highlight a really interesting figure. So our organizational budget in 2021 is just over 500,000. We're just breaking that sort of line, and in many organizations and businesses, it's like, are you over or under that 500,000 mark? With that budget, we have 5 full-time and 1 part-time employees, but we rely on an incredible amount of not just time, but skills development and integrity, compassion, empathy from our community volunteers. So at any time, we have about 40 volunteers participating in our programming, and people kind of come and go. It's a pretty substantial way to give back to the community. It's different than just kind of showing up and putting in a shift somewhere. Also an important way to volunteer, but this really requires a lot of personal investment and some emotional investment. So for people who are seeking to get involved, They're welcome to first attend one of our monthly orientations, which are conveniently now held over Zoom. There's information on our website, which is lcjp.org. And from there, if they're interested, they can become a community member volunteer. And that means that they would participate in the restorative justice case. I do this because we sit in a circle, and their role would be to speak to how the community, the broader community, is impacted by a given crime. The figure that I wanted to share with you is that I calculated, there's a number in Colorado that's calculated by sort of nonprofit groups that values volunteer time at $29 an hour. And so when you look at the number of hours that volunteers give to LCJP, it totals approximately $120,000 a year. It's how we value our volunteer time. Okay, so tuck that number away. And now another important figure for people to know, in the state of Colorado, it costs $130,000 for us to incarcerate one youth for 1 year.
Wow.
Right? And we know what the recidivism or reoffense is for folks who have experienced incarceration, right? It goes up to 60, 70, 80%. So when you think about it, how do individuals, residents of this state, how do we want to choose to invest our money and our resources? You know, should we put it into programs, diversionary programs like restorative justice, where community volunteers are those who are actually finding ways to give back and keep individuals out of the system that otherwise costs us? You know, that $130,000 for one person for 1 year. And that doesn't even take into account all the costs of parole and additional servicing that happens afterwards. So just an interesting figure to plan to, maybe there's some entrepreneurs out there who want to create some sort of amazing business strategy model to create more awareness about the efficacy of this programming.
Absolutely. I mean, it sounds like the money that you're saving is, orders of magnitude more than what your resources are. So it looks like your ROI is a no-brainer, right?
I agree completely.
So Kathleen, how does this work in a individual scenario? Can you break it down for us?
Yeah, happy to. So as I said, just to paint the broad picture, the offenders who are eligible for restorative justice in Longmont can be youth or adults. They can have committed a misdemeanor or felony level crime, and they can have already had a criminal record. So what happens is when the Longmont police get called out for service and they make that first contact with the offender and victim, they're looking for two main criteria. So is the offender taking responsibility for their actions? And that's kind of that question that frames why, when they come to us, we start using the term responsible person. And then, is the victim or harm party giving consent for the case to go to restorative justice instead of court? And I'll just mention here, if that's the case, they give their consent, then we can move forward. And at that point, the harm party has the choice whether or not to participate. So if they choose not to participate, they're welcome to submit a victim impact statement, which will be read at the restorative justice process, or they can participate through a surrogate victim. Our primary goal is not to cause additional harm for the person who's already experienced harm. So we give them many options for what participation can look like. So to give you a specific example, many people in Longmont were aware of the incident of vandalism at the Mountain View Cemetery in 2013. There were 6 individuals involved. 2 of them were adults, 4 of them were youth, and one of the 6 already had a warrant out for his arrest. So he was not considered eligible for restorative justice because he had a lot of other cases pending with the criminal justice system. The other 5 took responsibility. So the officer, in this case, it was detectives, after investigating the case, met that criteria for responsibility from all 5. And then from cemetery staff and representatives, they also provided their consent. So from there, a police report comes directly to the LCJP staff. At that time, I was a program manager in our community restorative justice program. So what that meant was I received the report. We're very fortunate that the Longmont Public Safety has given us a small office space at the Safety and Justice Center. So we're really integrated into that world. After reading through the case, our staff will match that case with 2 trained volunteer facilitators. So we read through it, and then I also forgot to mention we do an intake call. So the staff reaches out to each responsible and harm party and their parents, if they're juveniles, to understand more about the incident from their perspective, make sure the case is eligible, and then also educate them on what to expect from restorative justice. From there, we match the case with 2 trained volunteer facilitators. The facilitators will then meet with each responsible and harm party separately in what we call a pre-conference. That's basically the prep meeting for coming together into what we call a community group conference. That conference involves the 2 facilitators. In this cemetery case, it involved the 5 responsible parties with their support people. And then we had 2 employees of the cemetery, plus a board member from the cemetery whose family plot on that property had been damaged. And then we have the referring officer from the case. So the police also participate in this dialogue. And then volunteer community members to represent the broader community. In the cemetery case, we had 2 youth, young adult community members, and then we had 1 adult. That conference focuses on what happened and what can you take responsibility for, who was impacted and how. So every person present, with the exception of the facilitators who are impartial parties, answers that question. We do a discussion about strengths and goals for the future, as they mentioned. And then there's a brainstorm around what can be done to repair the harms. So we're trying to get specific actions that the responsible person can take to repair the harms that they've caused and to ideally utilize their strengths in those repairs. So those ideas will all be discussed, and through a consensus process, we determine a reparative contract for each of the 5 responsible parties. So their contracts don't all have to look the same. That's another way that our approach is distinguished from the criminal justice system, which kind of gives out a blanket punishment sentence to anybody, regardless of their degree of involvement in a particular incident. So in the cemetery case, the primary harm had been caused to individuals whose plot had been damaged, but also the staff who had to do all the manual labor to try to make things, get things back into place. There were some things that were irreparable. There was a Civil War memorial statue that was knocked over that was thousands of dollars to repair, and that has a lot of meaning and significance in the Longmont community. So there were some things, people ask well, how do you make things right? That's beyond repair. And the way that we do that is by involving multiple people to come forward and voice what they think is necessary, what will be adequate to experience repair. So in the case of the cemetery vandalism, each of the 5 individuals involved committed to a certain amount of financial restitution. They each committed to a large number of community service hours, which involved trying to prioritize doing repair that had resulted from the floods of 2013. So really doing some manual labor to try to improve the community, respond to this really impactful event. Each of them wrote apology letters, including apology letters directly to the staff of the cemetery as well as to the community. And those letters were shared anonymously on Memorial Day, where there's an annual ceremony for the holiday. Additionally, one of the letters was published anonymously in the Times Call to try to reach more people, to let them know what was on the other side of this restorative justice process. In addition to those agreements, each of the responsible parties had something that was really specific to them, something that they needed to do with their immediate family members, their immediate community, that was strengths based, and a slightly more creative thing for them to express an apology or express the learning that they had had. Each contract has a deadline. Every responsible person can have a separate deadline. They don't all have to be grouped together. Our contract deadlines are typically about 3 to 6 months out. This cemetery vandalism case was an exception because the number of community service hours and the restitution amount were quite a huge undertaking, especially for our youth. So we had a longer contract deadline for them. And quite wonderfully, all 5 individuals completed their contracts by the deadline, which means that none of them will have a criminal charge on their record. And for those 5, 4 youth, 1 adult, those were going to be felony level charges because of the degree of damage. So we're really, really proud. The cemetery staff was really impressed and pleased with the process. Now, I'll just explain, because people typically want to know if those individuals hadn't completed their contracts, or if they reoffend while under contract, that basically invalidates their contracts and their case would be referred back to the conventional system, and they would be issued a summons or an arrest and go to court. So that's kind of the follow-up consequence if an individual doesn't complete their contract. But as I mentioned, we have it's every year between 90 and 95% completion rate.
Wow. That is such an interesting story. It's very cool that you guys were able to take the higher route and give these people opportunity rather than just hammering them like a nail, right? You hear about all of these really high rates of incarceration in the United States. I mean, our rates of incarceration are right up there with some of the authoritarian regimes. So it's very cool and heartening to see people like you who are doing something to change that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, when you look at the statistics around mass incarceration, it's clear in my mind that our system of punishment is not in line with our alleged goals as a nation around really being a country that prioritizes human rights, that believes in the promise of every individual to kind of forge their own path and celebrate their freedoms and give to the community while furthering their own lives. And one of the things that really comes through in an intense way for me is how many ideas, how many creative and brilliant thinkers are we not hearing because we've locked them up for, many for life? And is that actually helping us create the communities that we want? I don't see alignment there. I understand that for some individuals who have committed a violent crime, there needs to be an intervention, right? That for safety for themselves and others, there needs to be some sort of separation. But I don't think that it's a one size fits all response. And I think the way that we utilize incarceration at this time is not aligned with changing behavior, creating safe and successful ways for people to reintegrate after they've served their time. In Colorado, 48% of incarcerated individuals will reoffend and go back to prison within 3 years of their release. From an economic standpoint, it's like, why would we invest in a product that is clearly failing, right? I mean, that's kind of crazy in a lot of ways. So yeah, when we look at things like restorative justice, in my mind, there's a lot of evidence that they just make sense and that they really support and further goals around safety, connection, human rights, and really forming ways for people to learn more about each other. Challenges, restorative justice challenges the biases and assumptions that we hold about people who are different from us, because we come together and actually get to listen to each other in respectful dialogue.
Absolutely. One thing that I've always liked about entrepreneurship is the fact that you rethink it. Just because the status quo is one way doesn't mean it has to be forever. And I really feel like what you're doing is very similar in that, we've had a criminal justice system that performed its actions in one manner, but it doesn't mean that that's the right way to do it. And I think that this is a great, first few steps toward changing a mentality where, you know, we shouldn't go to lock up our neighbors right off the bat. We should try to help them. And if one of the things I took away from the documentary was that there's often underlying circumstances that these people are dealing with. They are not they're not living happy, healthy lives. They have extenuating circumstances that if you were to remove that pain or that other extenuating circumstance, they might not be in that situation.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I mean, we all have complex stories, and on any given day, something might be going pretty terribly wrong for me or you. And one of the reasons that we use those terms, responsible and harm party, is that we want to move away from this binary that the criminal justice system creates, where you're either an offender or a victim. I'm sure you can identify a time in your life where you were victimized or you experienced harm. And probably you can identify a time where you hurt somebody else, intentionally or not intentionally, right? And so we acknowledge that people are living in that continuum, and what is the potential for change if we can say to our neighbors and our community members, hey, I see you in your humanity, and recognize that we're not living in these static events that have to produce an adversarial dynamic where all of a sudden I can't trust you ever again. I have to dig my heels in, hold a grudge. By the way, all of this also applies to really how we are with each other outside of the justice system, right? So if you and I are coworkers and I say something kind of snarky or sideways as a staff meeting, right? I might offend you. And I need to be able to learn from that versus you sitting next to me for the next 15 years just being really annoyed with me, right? Which will
Holding a grudge, right?
Holding a grudge. Yeah, this is something that we offer training in at LCJP, and I hear so often from teams, workplace teams, folks who work together in a school or any workplace. They're holding these grudges based on something that maybe happened, like I said, 15 or 20 years ago. And I just think about how that affects well-being, from the employer's standpoint, how that affects actual output and productivity, the ability to communicate well, to design and create well, in the world of entrepreneurship. So I feel really strongly that it's important for folks to learn new skills for addressing conflict, and even before that, how to develop stronger relationships that are grounded in a sense of respect and responsibility, so that when the conflict happens, we have tools to come together and create repair.
So this really reminds me of something. Sorry, let me do that again. This really reminds me of the truth and reconciliation process in South Africa after apartheid. Does that have any connection?
Yeah, yes, it does. Great question. So to go back even further than that, it's really important in the world of restorative justice to highlight the fact that the concept behind this work really comes from ancient practices of indigenous people from all over the world, right? So when people were living in tribes and villages and small communities, if someone caused harm, there wasn't any place to send them, and they were necessary to the community. Every person's labor, every person's role was invaluable for the survival of the collective. So in Native American cultures, there were peacemaking processes, right? That people sat in circle. Typically, there was a council of elders that the person who caused harm would speak to, and there would be a spiritual aspect to it, a ritual aspect, and so really this practice of restorative justice is kind of just coming back. So we saw it exactly as you said in the truth and reconciliation processes in South Africa, also following the genocide in Rwanda. There are other smaller examples of restorative justice processes being used post-violent conflict throughout the world. And now in North America and Western Europe, they're being integrated in this way that we're using in Longmont. And I'm sorry, I shouldn't leave out other parts of the world. New Zealand is also a leader. Restorative justice is used nationwide. There's restorative justice processes throughout Europe and Australia. I'm learning more and more about what's happening in Central and South America, also in Canada. So it's actually,
Wow.
I can't leave out any continent. Because at this point, throughout the country, throughout the world, there's essentially like a revitalization of this connection to, oh, maybe this will work. Maybe we need to get back to those more human-centered processes and give ourselves agency. Give people more tools that they need to remain connected with their families and their communities.
Yeah, that's amazing. I had no idea it's had such a long history. Thanks for educating me on that.
Yeah, happy to.
Let's learn a little bit more about you, Kathleen. You've done so much for so many people. What motivated you to move from New Jersey out to Colorado?
Oh, thanks. Well, a lot of people could guess what might have led me out of New Jersey. I, I'm a fan. My parents live at the Jersey Shore. It's beautiful. It's a great place to go visit, especially if you live in landlocked Colorado.
Do you know Snooki?
Not yet. I have visited, the Seaside Heights Boardwalk where some of the Jersey Shore was filmed, but I didn't have any run-ins with Snooki. She might be an interesting candidate for restorative justice, depending
Probably.
depending on the level. I trust in her. So I left New Jersey after high school. I did my undergraduate studies at Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana, another destination place to live. And while at Notre Dame, I had the opportunity to study abroad twice in Latin America. I studied in Santiago, Chile, and also in Oaxaca, Mexico. And so that's where I really started exploring social justice issues and became pretty interested in the dynamics between the United States and Latin America, especially Mexico. Following my graduation, I graduated with a studio art major and a Latin American studies minor. And following graduation, I volunteered on the US Mexico border and later became the executive director of that nonprofit,
Wow.
where I was facilitating a program for groups of high school and college students from the US and Canada who would come down to Tijuana and the Baja Peninsula with an immersion, an experience of immersion in the culture and the dynamics of the border. So they would do a community service project. We focused on building relationships with local community members so that participants in the program could hear firsthand about people's lives, about what brought them north. Most people in Tijuana are not from Tijuana, they've migrated north for the economic opportunities. And then, of course, learning more about what was actually happening on the border, what it was like to cross, what it was like to be deported. And so after leading that organization for 3 years, I had this realization that, what was really driving me was an interest in peace building. I really was passionate about cross cultural facilitation and storytelling, with this idea that there's an opportunity to broaden perspectives so that people could start seeing each other in different ways, and that could actually lead towards more natural forms of people finding ways to respect each other. So I went back to school. I got a master's degree in international peace and conflict studies from the University of Innsbruck in Austria. I was
Wow.
excited to go international again.
Yeah.
And I was finishing that program and decided that I would come to Colorado because my two wonderful brothers and niece and nephew are here in Boulder County. So I landed here to write my master's thesis. And in the process, I happened to look up an author whose book I was reading. Her name is Angie Lederach. And I thought, she's my age. She must be doing something interesting. And she had worked at LCJP in the past. And so
Wow.
I was sitting in Boulder and I was like, what's happening in Longmont? Like, what's this restorative justice thing? I was drawn to restorative justice because the focus of my master's program was conflict transformation. So this idea that conflict is not a problem that we're going to approach with some formula, plug into the formula, and then the problem will go away. Instead, conflict transformation says that conflict actually presents a platform for us to approach with certain skills and attitudes, and that in the process of addressing the conflict with other involved parties, we can actually all experience growth and transformation from that and find more ways to see the world, which kind of relates back to my goals as a peace builder. So I thought, okay, well, here it is, right next door in Longmont, and that's how I landed in 2013. I got hired as a bilingual case coordinator. So yeah, I'm celebrating 8 years of having worked with LCJP.
Wow. To the community's benefit. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Having this conversation is really making me think about the polarization of today's politics. Do you think that your techniques could be used to, quell some of the partisanship that's occurring right now?
I do. Yeah. Thanks for that question. I think that something that's true for me is that growing up, I didn't, I was not taught skills or techniques for having hard conversations, especially having hard conversations with people that I don't agree with. Right. So I think it's pretty common for many of us, we default to what we saw our parents doing or our older siblings or other family members. In school, we're taught find the nearest adult and tell them what happened. Right. So it's pretty disempowering in that way. And it also puts the third party, like the teacher or the administrator at school, in a pretty bad position because they have to make this judgment call without having observed typically what happened. So I do think that, to be clear, restorative approaches are not a magic wand. They do require people to take responsibility. They require people to suspend judgment and evaluation in an effort to really listen, right? This is something that is not happening in our political rhetoric, right? There's a lot of talk, 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 not a whole lot of listening, generally speaking. So if we can get to a place where people say voluntarily, like, yeah, I'd like to try something different. I'd like to try to sit and listen and explore, maybe it initially, say if we were to take two individuals from very different political sides of the spectrum, they might need a third party facilitator, likely. They might need some ground rules, right? Ground rules can go a long way. If you and I can agree that we might not agree, but we can agree on how we're going to have a hard conversation, and that the goal of our conversation is not to get to agreement, not to get to being best friends, simply to just listen, to listen respectfully, to speak respectfully. It's definitely my belief from my experience that that process alone helps chipping away at those assumptions and stereotypes and biases that people can tend to cling really closely to, that then build barriers between people, right? It's safe if I'm just over here. It's safe if I get really rid of, like we were talking about grudges earlier, if I dig my heels in over here. And that's simply not true, not realistic. Our safety is not found in getting further and further away from each other and creating more and more assumptions about each other. I think that there's so much more possibility and potential when we actually take a step towards each other, when we realize that we have a lot of shared human experiences, we do have a lot of shared fears, and that if people are just willing to start taking some vulnerability, there could be an opportunity to admit that I don't know what I don't know. There could be an opportunity to admit that maybe I was wrong once or more times. Those small steps, I think, hold the promise of going a long way.
Absolutely. So when I was in grad school getting my MBA, one of the classes or series of classes that I thought was the most impactful to me was the team building and the leadership classes. And they were both very heavy in emotional intelligence and being able to empathize with others. I think that a lot of people could benefit from those skills. I mean, I was surprised I never learned any of that in undergrad. But for people who are interested in learning more about those types of skills, do you have any resources for them or suggestions?
Yeah, I would love to invite people to get involved at LCJP. Our training program for volunteers is really focused on a wide range of emotional intelligence, how to sort of not just tap into that intelligence, but then how to find the words to express it, right? So often with our volunteers, something that happens is folks show up and they want to be so helpful that they might end up being enabling. So something that we really coach folks on is how to use certain tools like a reflective statement to indicate that I've heard you, that you've been heard, and then asking an open-ended question to elicit more information. Or if I hear somebody say something that's very escalated and charged, how can I reframe what I've heard them say in a way that really emphasizes what their need might be? Because we encourage people to bring expressions of needs into the restorative justice conference. Um, all of those are grounded in empathy, like you said, really making sure that I demonstrate to somebody that I'm hearing them, I'm with them, I'm not taking responsibility for them or their experience, and yet they can feel heard and respected. So that is kind of the foundational skill set that we work on with our volunteers. So people are more than invited. You will have an experience of what that's like at our very first monthly orientation. The first monthly orientation that you attend will give you a lived experience of the kinds of skills that we develop.
Sounds like a really important class. Not only would you be able to participate in the restorative justice program, but you get to take away some real important training on emotional intelligence.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Thanks for highlighting that.
So, Kathleen, what's next for you?
Well, LCJP has just been working closely with a group called Social Venture Partners, Boulder County. We were selected for their Catapult program, which involves a 3.5 year investment from SVP, Social Venture Partners. They have been providing us pro bono consultation along with a cash grant to support our projects. And so that has produced a strategic plan, a 3-year plan that we just finalized at the end of 2020. And so, there's three main areas that we're looking at there. One, program expansion. How can we serve even more individuals in the Longmont community and beyond? We heard through the strategic planning process that many of our stakeholders would like to see us be working more in educational environments, doing more in schools. We're also looking at how to expand our training offerings, realizing that there are many communities right now wanting to do something different with community police dynamics. And restorative justice offers one tool that can really change that dynamic. Two, we're looking at improving our marketing and branding and storytelling. And then three are equity, inclusion, and diversity goals. So we really want to figure out how to involve more diverse community members in volunteer positions. And that is both our volunteer roles for the actual conferences, our facilitators and community members, but also board membership. So our board has some pretty lofty goals, really important and lofty goals as part of that strategic plan. So I just want to mention with this opportunity that if anybody watching is curious about how to give back in a leadership capacity in Longmont, our board of directors is not only looking for prospective members, but also if you want to volunteer on a board committee where you would be able to offer your insight, your goals and visions for Longmont, but not have the formal responsibility of a board member. Maybe you'd like to grow into being a board member, but that's an opening right now that our board is really interested in filling. So board committee participation is something available to you. And if you are interested, it would be wonderful to hear from you. I'm sure that my contact information will get posted so that you can send me an email or reach me through Longmont Public Media.
Absolutely. I plan on reaching out and being part of one of those committees. I think that what you're doing is super impactful, and anything I can do to help, I will be pleased to. So until next time, I appreciate everyone watching. Please reach out to Kathleen if you have any interest. I hope you do, but stay savvy.